I don't know if I'm being heard. Let me assume that you can hear me. Okay, so I'm very sorry that for reasons completely beyond my control, I'm not able to be with you in person this evening. I was very much looking forward to visiting the foundation again and seeing many old friends. Now, in her beautiful talk, Maria Jose has told you about the current state of particle physics and the importance of the discovery of the Higgs boson by experiments at CERN at the Large Hadron Collider. I'm going to tell you something about how the LHC came to be built. With hindsight, the fact that it was built looks very logical, fit into the history of CERN, and you might think that it was inevitable. But actually, before it started, the Americans were building a much larger accelerator. It got cancelled, but before it was cancelled, it didn't seem so logical. In fact, many people thought it was wrong that we should build a machine in Europe as well. Nor did it seem inevitable. For example, on the 1st of May, 1993, the then Director General of CERN, Carlo Rubbia, when shown a new cost estimate of the cost of the LHC, declared it will never be built. And he handed to me the responsibility of putting together a proposal to build the LHC and presenting it to the CERN Council. Nor did it seem inevitable in October 1994, when the person responsible for funding research in the United Kingdom told me that I was staring into the abyss and that if we could not reduce the cost by 20%, it would never be built. I will come back to these incidents later. But in talking about the genesis of the LHC, I actually want to go back to the very beginning and begin with the genesis of CERN. Now, particle physics, the study of the constituents of matter and the forces that control their behavior at a subnuclear level, began with studying the debris of collisions of cosmic rays. These are particles that come from other parts of the galaxy or beyond the galaxy and impinge on the outer atmosphere. They collide in the upper atmosphere and produce further particles. And they were discovered in people who went up in balloons to look at what happened up there in 1911. And in the first elementary particles were discovered in collisions, the debris of collisions of cosmic rays. But the number of cosmic rays with a given energy falls very rapidly. At the energies that were available, let's say at the end of the 1950s, there's about 1 cosmic ray per square meter per second hitting the upper atmosphere. But at the energies we're studying at the LHC, we're talking about 1 particle per square meter per century. So you could never do experiments with that. And at the end of the Second World War, it was clear that this era would come to an end as people built bigger and bigger accelerators, and particularly they were being built in America. In the late 1940s, CERN was conceived with dual aims when 2 ideas came together. The European cosmic ray physicists realized that they couldn't afford, none of the countries in Europe could afford to build accelerators as big as those being built in the United States, and that if we wanted to compete, we would have to collaborate. At the same time, a group of far-sighted diplomats and administrators were looking for a project to try out whether we could learn to live together after the Second World War. Would it be possible to have a project that involved the French and the Germans, the British and the Italians? This is the late 1940s. Well, this idea was taken up by UNESCO, the United Nations Organization for Education, Science and Culture, which has the label Science for Peace. And in 1951, it set up a body called the European Council for Nuclear Research to study this idea. And this body very soon decided that the aim should be to build a large accelerator. In 1952, Geneva was chosen as the site. Actually, that wasn't straightforward. There was opposition from the Communist Party of Geneva. I don't know if there is such a thing now, but then there was a Communist Party and they demanded a referendum. but 2/3 of the population of Geneva said, yes, we'd like to have this here. This body drafted a convention. It had to be signed. It had to be ratified by the parliaments. And the convention came into force in 1954. Already, ground had been broken. Here you see it in May 1954. And here's the laying of the foundation stone of the big main building. In November 1959, the first big accelerator at CERN, the proton synchrotron, came into existence. You see it here. It's covered with buildings now. You can no longer see it. It's about 200 meters across in diameter. And that, when it started, was the largest accelerator in the world. It's still working, although every part has been changed, and it acts as a stage in accelerating particles in the LHC, as Lynn Evans will describe in his talk. Let's jump to CERN today. The original proton synchrotron, you can't see it's under these buildings. It puts particles into something called the super proton synchrotron, which then go into the LHC. And this is the footprint on the surface where the LHC is underground, just a line on a map. It's about 100 meters underground. It's 17 kilometers round. Here's the same thing from space. This is the runway of the airport. And meanwhile, CERN has turned into a global organization, attracting users who commute to and from CERN to carry out experiments from all over the globe, about 12,000. And I think it has succeeded in its aims of enabling outstanding science and fostering collaboration. Now, let's go back to the beginning. When CERN's proton synchrotron came into existence, it produced good results, but the Americans had built machines not as big as the PS, although they very shortly did, built one at Brookhaven on Long Island, but they had much more experience with the accelerators they built in the 50s, and the major discoveries were made in the United States. And from 1968 onwards, at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, which found point-like particles inside protons. This was the first direct evidence for the existence of quarks, though they were inferred from other things before that. CERN's first major results came in the early 1970s. Neutral currents, these are interactions transmitted by the Z boson, which you've heard about earlier, and experiments with neutrinos showed that these point-like particles were, in fact, quarks. They had the properties of quarks. Once the proton synchrotron began, there was a big debate at CERN whether they should build a machine that collided two beams of protons head-on, or a bigger proton synchrotron which extracted a beam and smashed it into a stationary target. Now, here's my first slide on technical choices. What's the difference? If you collide two beams head-on, each with energy E, by getting to high E, you can get to short distances, as Maria Jose has explained, but also you can use that energy to create heavy particles using Einstein's relation E equals mc squared. If you crash particles into a fixed target, you have to get to much higher energy to do the same effect. Now, you might think if you collide your car at 50 kilometers an hour with another 50 kilometers an hour, that has the same damage as colliding one at 100 miles an hour with one at rest. So all you've got to do is double the velocity, that's 4 times the energy. But that's not true. For speeds approaching the speed of light, Einstein's relativity comes into play, and you have to go to much higher energy. At the Large Hadron Collider, for example, beams are accelerated through 7 tera-electron volts. That's the same as the voltage produced by 3.5 billion little AAA batteries. Now, to get the same effect as these colliding two such beams head-on, you'd have to go 100,000 times higher in energy with a fixed target, and that's beyond our budget, so you don't do that. So we collide things head-on. That doesn't mean that fixed targets are not good things to have, because they're much denser than colliding with another bunch of particles. So you can study rare events, and you can make secondary beams of particles, pi mesons and k mesons, which were discussed in the previous talk. By the way, there's one thing I'd like to mention. I've spoken many times about the Large Hadron Collider, and nobody ever has asked me, what is a hadron? Actually, a hadron is a word we use meaning a heavy particle. And it actually, well, that's what it means in Greek, a heavy particle. We use it to describe any particle which feels the strong force. And the particles that don't feel the strong force we call leptons, which is from Greek meaning light, though one of them is quite heavy, in fact. Now, if I go back, it was decided to build both these machines. Here is the world's first proton-proton collider, 2 different accelerators, storing beams going round and round and round in opposite directions, colliding here. And that is the grandfather or the father of the LHC. And it was the skills that CERN learned in building this machine that enabled the superproton synchrotron to be turned into a proton-antiproton collider, which, as we just heard, discovered the W and Z bosons, and it also developed the skills that were later used to build the LHC. Now, while this debate was going on, there was a big argument. Do we want proton-proton, or do we want a fixed target? And it was decided to do both. But this project ran into trouble. Nobody could agree on the site. It was thought it'd be good to have it somewhere else in Europe, and it was too expensive. But John Adams, who was the director, said, well, why don't we build it at CERN? And we can put it underground. That had been proposed earlier, but never been done. And we can use the existing accelerator as an injector, and we can use the existing experimental labs and offices and save a lot of money. The upshot of this was that Europe had all its high energy physics eggs in 1 1/4 baskets. The quarter is the lab in Germany that has a different sort of accelerator. In America, they spread the goodies around more widely. At one time, there were 3 or even 4 laboratories competing. And this is what allowed Europe to get ahead by focusing on one laboratory. And the idea of reusing the infrastructure was fundamentally, it allowed the Large Electron Positron Collider and the LHC to be built without an increase in the budget. Now, as the SPS neared completion, it was switched on in 1976, thoughts begin to turn to what should we do next? And at that time, from these results at Stanford, which had seen these point-like particles inside protons and neutrons, there was a lot of enthusiasm for making colliders that used electrons and anti-electrons, positrons. And Burton Richter was later the director of the Stanford lab, spent a sabbatical at CERN, and he proposed building a 100 GeV electron-positron collider. By the way, this is a picture of Burton Richter at the formal inauguration of the superproton synchrotron, and this person talking to him is me. I was asked to give a talk about the physics of the project as a young physicist. I was much younger then, obviously, who would benefit from the physics discoveries. On that occasion, the first time I ever addressed a live audience of over 1,000 people is what turned my hair white. Now, the Large Hadron Collider, the Large Electron Positron Collider quickly gained support, this idea, and was endorsed by the European Committee for Future Accelerators. But John Adams, who'd built the PS and the SPS, didn't like electron machines and favored a proton accelerator. So here's my second technical choice. What particles to accelerate? If you accelerate protons, the difficulty is it's not actually the proton you want to study. It's the quarks and gluons inside them, which only carry a small fraction of the energy. So to get a reasonable rate of you have to go to you can only study things maybe up to 1/10 of the energy of the proton. On the other hand, if you look at electrons and positrons, they're point-like, so you can use all the energy. But the difficulty is you can't get them to very high energy because, as you've heard in the previous talk, charged particles are surrounded by electric fields, electromagnetic fields. And when you bend them in an accelerator, some of the energy in that field tries to go straight on. It's much more reluctant to do so with heavy particles like a proton, and there is radiation when they bend in a circle, but it's a very small amount. On the other hand, with electrons and positrons, you have to keep putting back huge amounts of energy that are lost. So it's very expensive to get to high energies. On the other hand, with protons, you can get to high energies, but you can only study a fraction of the energy of the proton because you're interested in the quarks and the gluons. You can compensate for that by having many, many protons, as many as possible, but then there's a lot of noise and it gets harder and harder to do the experiments. Anyway, it was decided Adams was opposed to building LEP, the electron machine, but in the end said, all right, if you guys want to build a proton machine, I will support that, provided you make the tunnel large enough to hook up a proton machine in it later. So this was the first idea of the LHC. We will build LEP, and later we will put a proton machine in it. At the LEP summer study, this was before LEP was approved in 1978, I was the leader of the theoretical group there. We were arguing, you not only need to make the tunnel wide enough to have a proton machine in it, make it as big as possible. There were people who were saying, for the purposes of LEP, you could have a 15-kilometer tunnel. But many of us said, or a 20-kilometer tunnel. We don't want to do that because we can't build a 20-kilometer tunnel and later go back to the governments and say, please build us a 30-kilometer tunnel. So let's go for a bigger tunnel as we can possibly get the governments to pay for. And in the end, and also for geological reasons, it was 27 kilometers. So let me go forward now. First of all, looking at CERN, and then what was happening in the United States in parallel. So in 1978, Carlo Rubbia had the idea that we could use the existing accelerator relatively cheaply, because if you put an antiproton into it, you'd have to make the antiprotons, so you wouldn't have many of them, but they would go through the accelerator in the opposite direction of the proton. We could have a proton-antiproton collider, and with this tremendous amplifier effect of colliding head-on, get to very high energies. And he hoped they would discover the W and the Z. That, in fact, happened in 1983. And meanwhile, LEP was approved in 1981. Meanwhile, in the United States, they were building a big proton-proton collider with what were called 2-in-1 magnets. Instead of having two separate accelerators, as I've shown you with the intersecting storage rings at CERN, there were two beams inside a common structure. In a way we'll come back to. But they ran into all sorts of technical difficulties. These technical difficulties sort of coincided with the discovery of the W and the Z, when the New York Times had a headline, Europe W, USA, not even Z0. And this led to a decision in the summer of 1983 to cancel this proton collider, Isabel, and encouraged by Reagan's science advisor, who said, we want to regain leadership, which Europe had taken with the discovery of the W and the Z, push for a 40 TeV collider. It was never admitted, but this energy was quite obviously chosen to be much bigger than anything would be possible in the LEP tunnel, because it was known that we were thinking of putting something in the LEP tunnel after LEP, and render the LHC sort of not worth doing. Now, while this was just an idea, the International Committee for Future Accelerators was preparing a summit conference in 1984, and it was clear that the Americans were going to present the proposal for building this giant machine, 40 tera-electron volt machine. And Herbert Schopper, who you see here, the then Director General of CERN, said, we've got to be able to present what we can do later in the LEP tunnel. So he set up a study of the LHC. Now, this is a slide from Peter Jenny. You can see his name here, and these are the proceedings of the proposal. It was Peter Jenny who led one of the big experiments at the beginning, the Atlas experiment. And you see here his statement on this slide. It all began with this workshop in 1984. Now, in this workshop, I was asked to make the physics case, and you can see I said a theoretical consensus emerging that new phenomena will be discovered at or below 1 TeV, and in fact, it has a lot of what turned out to be the physics case. There's a lot of things on how to discover the Higgs with this machine. By the way, at that time, the idea was to keep LEP and put the LHC up in the air above it. That would have been extremely difficult to do, and that idea was abandoned later. But the idea made it different from the American project, which didn't have anything like that. Now, what happened in that workshop? The physics case for the LHC and the SSC is very surprisingly essentially unchanged after 30 years. At that time, we understood that if we put more and more particles into the LHC, that in technical terms meant getting to what's called higher luminosity, the more and more particles in the bunches that collide, the rarer and rarer events you can see, effectively the higher energy you could get to. We theorists understood that if we could get a high enough luminosity, the LHC, although much lower in energy, might be able to compete with the SSC. But the experimentalists said, you're crazy. You'll never go even to what, in units I won't bother with, 10 to the 33, probably impossible. And by the way, these bunches of particles cross 40 million times a second at the LHC. And every time they cross, the particles collide and debris comes into the detectors. And at that time, if you read the proceedings, it says there was a consensus that the number of events per bunch crossing should never exceed 1, or the detectors will be completely flooded and we won't be able to do the experiments. Actually, the record is now at actually 2 times 10 to the 34. The 2's got lost here somehow. And in the last run of the machine, it was at 35, although the consensus was that would be impossible, with a maximum at 70. And when the higher luminosity version of the LHC comes online in 2029, we will be up, instead of 70, the maximum number maybe up to 200. At this project, the SSC was presented as a national project, as much criticized by the Japanese, but it really was, they were thinking we'd go forward in parallel with a project in Europe and one in the United States. The LHC, presented by Giorgio Brianti, who was then the project leader, based on 2-in-1 magnets, but almost everything else has changed subsequently. Now, CERN at that date set up a long-range planning group chaired by Carlo Rubbia, who recommended that CERN's next big project after LEP should be the LHC. They looked at the idea of putting a proton-antiproton collider, which would have been much cheaper, but they concluded, rightly I think, that would not be able to accelerate enough particles, because you have to make the antiprotons. You simply couldn't get enough of them to get a decent rate of collision and make many major discoveries. So they recommended to build the LHC, but they said experiments of more than 10 to the 32 will require novel instrumentation. And as I've told you, we're now a factor of 200 above that. Also recommended intensified R&D on magnets to bend the particles in the accelerator, and a program of detector R&D to make it possible to go beyond this 10 to the 32 number. And that happened. Meanwhile, the experimental program evolved in a series of workshops, and the key one, in a sense, was the last. I was there, I gave the experimental talk, it's the one I know most about, and what have become the LHC experiments, well, 2 of them merged, were presented in that meeting. And at that meeting, really the basis for the experimental program of the LHC was laid. So that was in 1982. Now, meanwhile, the Council of CERN, where the representatives of the governments who fund CERN, well, you, the taxpayer, ultimately fund CERN, but the governments come together, we've been kept aware that the project, the idea of building the LHC. And they have various reactions. Some liked it, others said, just hang on a moment. The SSC is being built, it's more powerful. We're not sure we really need this, because the LHC was approved in 1987. There was a big push by Carlo Rubbia and Bill Mitchell, who was the president of the CERN Council. And they asked for a special open session of the CERN Council in December 1991 to make the case to the public or to the general physics community and to the governments for building the LHC. At that time, I was the chairman of the CERN Scientific Policy Committee, and I was asked to present the scientific case for the LHC. Now, some of you in the audience may be too young to remember the days before PowerPoint, but we used plastic transparencies, and this is a copy of the final, rather smudged page of my plastic transparency. We need to get collisions for 1 tera electron volt. To get there, because the quarks only carry a fraction of the momentum of the protons, we must go to much higher energy. The only route to get there right now is the LHC. It's the most cost-effective route. That was sort of a dig at the SSC, which was going to be much more expensive. And it would allow us, because we were able to put heavy ions already at CERN into the accelerator, to collide protons with bigger nuclei, which has happened. And because at that time we wanted to keep lead, study the collisions of electrons and protons, which didn't happen. At the end of this session, the chairman of the council, Bill Mitchell, declared LHC is the right machine for the advance of the subject and the future of CERN, and that CERN should provide more detailed information on the project by the end of 1993, so that the council may move to a decision on the LHC. Meeting is closed. At the next meeting, however, the Germans came back and said, that's what it says in the minutes, but that was not the conclusion. We never agreed to this we agreed to the first statement, but we didn't agree that we should move to the decision at the end of 1993. But it was nevertheless agreed that the project should be presented. So what happened? I come back to the event that I mentioned earlier on the 1st of May, 1993, where in a meeting, it was a Saturday, by the way, in Carlo Rubbio's office, Giorgio Brianti presented the latest cost estimates to the Evans, who was due to take over from Giorgio at the end of the year, and myself, I was due to take over from Carlo Rubbio. And that was when Carlo said, this is too expensive, it will never be built, I don't want to present something that will never be built, and anyway, I won't be there. Would I put together the proposal and present it, which I did. Then the situation changed in October 1993. It became much easier to make the case for the LHC because the SSC had run into huge financial problems and it was cancelled. I'm now going to make a sort of interruption to talk about what happened on the world stage, and then I'll come back to November 1993. So the World Committee, the International Committee for Future Accelerators, had a summit conference following the cancellation of the SSC. And some of the Americans said, hey, why don't you not present the LHC to the Council in December, but we wait and we will simultaneously present a proposal to build a big electron-positron collider in the United States and the LHC at CERN, and we will go to the governments of the world and say, we've got our act together, here's a big program for world particle physics. Well, I was representing CERN at this meeting and I said, there's no way. We've been told to present the project. We can't say, sorry, Council, you told us to present it, we're not going to present it. We were all geared up, so we presented it. So that idea was dropped, and by January, the world, through the International Committee of Future Accelerators, had come in line saying we really want to build the LHC. And by the summer of 1994, the Americans had said they would contribute to the LHC. although at a rather lousy level of $400 million. And even that, only if their budget was increased, which didn't happen. Nevertheless, we negotiated more, not as much as we wanted, not as much as our governments wanted, but more than the US particle physicists had told the government should go in. In December 1993, we were coming up to present the proposal in December, and we set up an external review of the project. I felt that if I want to go to the governments and say, spend all these billions on this project, we had to have the design validated. And the review, chaired by Robert A. Marr, who was later the director of CERN, gave it a very, very clean bill of health. The design is good. There's no doubt it can be done. The technical choices are right. The cost estimates are right. There's no need for contingency. This is pretty extraordinary, given that the R&D was still underway and the big magnets that were used had never been tested. Nevertheless, that's what he said. So we presented the proposal in December of that year, and what happened? The Council's reaction was generally positive, but Germany and the UK said they were very unwilling to approve the project. They wouldn't approve a bump in the budget, and we asked us to look for cost savings. The plan was revised, we found some savings, and in June we went back to the governments. And then there were 19 members of CERN then, we got it put to the vote. I thought this is the right thing to do. Let's get the 17 countries who are willing to do it to vote yes on the record. And then we said we will suspend the vote while Germany and the UK make up their mind. But Germany and the UK said, we want further cost savings. And what's more, we want France and Switzerland, who are getting some of the financial benefits from people spending their salaries, because that's what the project was, we want them to pay more. And this was the point when the person responsible for UK funding told me I was staring into the abyss if I couldn't knock 20% off the project, which was not really possible. And some wit sent me this proposal to build the Leaning Tower of Pisa, where the proponents are saying, look, we can save 700 lira by not taking soil tests. And they didn't do it, and we know what happened. Probably a rather good investment, because it brought in all the tourists, the fact that it's leaning. But you can't just take 20% off the project, although in a sense we find to do so. In the autumn, Germany and the UK said, all right, we will visit and vote for it, but only on the assumption that the increase of the budget is less than inflation by 1%. So please build it on a budget that's going down in real terms, which wasn't possible. So we pulled out of the drawer an old idea, which had been used when the SPS was approved, of saying, okay, we will, in the first stage, we will build the LHC, but every third magnet we will leave out. That will save a lot of money. So we'll only be able to get to 2/3 of the final energy. That would have probably been enough to find the Higgs boson, by the way, and we'll build the rest later. So that was the proposal we went to. We said, we'll build 2/3 of the machine. We can get the budget down like that, but we will only do it under the condition that if we get any money from the rest of the world, it will be used to speed up and improve the project, go back to one stage, not to allow reductions in the member states' contribution. And the governments agreed to that, although they later went back on it and said, all right, try to get more money. And 1997, we'll decide whether to go to one stage. But there was a last minute hiccup, which I'm going to tell you about. On the 15th of December, in a closed session where we were preparing for the big formal open session with the representatives of the governments the next day, it looked as if everybody was prepared to vote yes the next day. And at the last moment, the Germans said, well, actually, we personally are agreed, the people at the meeting, but we haven't got clearance yet from Bonn. Those of you who are young won't remember that the German government was then in Bonn. We're going to have to telephone Bonn to get permission. The rest of us went downtown for the traditional annual council dinner at the Hotel Beau Rivage. By the way, I judged this was an unnecessary extravagance, and from 1995 onwards, the dinner had been held at CERN. And we left the German delegates headed by a gentleman called Strube, with two people who some of you in the audience will know, Horst Weniger and Günter Wolf at CERN, to call up Bonn to get permission. So they called up their boss in Bonn, Hans Eschelbacher, and Eschelbacher said, I'm sorry, I don't have permission to let you vote yes the next day. Without knowing it, Horst Weniger and Günter Wolf went next door, and they called up another physicist who some of you may know, Harold Fritsch in Munich, because it was known that Harold had very good personal contacts with Helmut Kohl, who was then the German chancellor. And Harold called up Helmut Kohl's office and said, please put pressure on Eschelbacher, tell him he's got to vote yes tomorrow. Germany must vote yes. So Kohl's office called up Eschelbacher and said, please go back from the parliament to your office and study the dossier. Eschelbacher got back to the minister, Rutgers, got back to his office, met Rutgers and met Eschelbacher and said, I'm fed up with this. I'm not prepared to look at the dossier again, and left. Eschelbacher called Strube and said he didn't say yes, I'm afraid, but he didn't say no. And Strube very courageously interpreted the fact that he didn't say no as being that he could vote yes. So the next day, the vote was yes. So following that vote, we negotiated as instructed contributions from a number of countries listed here. And in June 1996, I thought we had enough money to go back to building the LHC at one stage. And I asked in June 1996, can we bring forward the review to the 19th review that was proposed for 97, bring it forward to the end of 96 and agree to build the LHC in one step. By the way, this fact that we were building it in two steps was a very powerful negotiating tool, because if we begin to the Americans and say, please give us money for something we're going to do anyway, it would have been very difficult. But we said, please give us money for something we're going to do, but in two steps. But if you help, we can do it much better, much faster, and you will benefit. So in a way, that was a very good thing that we were told to build it in two steps. So we agreed to bring the review forward. But in August, there was a complete bombshell. Germany, which was suffering from a financial impact of reunification of East and West Germany, asked for a 10% cut in its budget. They said, it's only we who want the cut. But the British, reneging on the agreement and things the minister had told me earlier, said, if they're going to get a cut, we've all got to get a cut. So we're faced in a really difficult position. Without the cut, we had enough money to build it in one step. But if we had a 10% cut, we did not have enough money, and we'd have to go back on the agreement with all the other countries. The only way out of this was to borrow money. But the German government has always said, we will never allow loans. However, in these circumstances, in a rather difficult meeting in Bonn, we persuaded them they would let us borrow money and build the LHC. Meanwhile, the particle physicists, don't forget that in this era, we were still upgrading LEP, and we were still looking for money to get one more year of operation, both of which happened. So there were lots of things going on at once. It was a very busy period. So in December 1996, single stage construction was approved, accompanied by cuts in the budget on the basis of loans. I had repeatedly told the council that this is very risky, and they said, okay, we understand that. We will share the risk. Come back to us if you get into trouble. But I had left by then. At the end of 98, I left. And when I left, the LHC was past the point of no return. The agreement with the USA had been signed. We were not going to go back on that. And by value, half of the contracts had been signed. Overall, at that point, in line with the estimates. Well, I then left, and I'm not going to go through what happened between then and the startup. There were difficulties. There was a large cost overrun, some technical troubles. But in the switch up, then these technical difficulties were recovered, lining up for the approval on the startup of the machine, which was published would happen on the 10th of December. But then there was a big setup, a step back. Some people in America said, if you build the LHC, it may take the vacuum of the universe from its current state into a lower energy state and destroy all of us. And this was the headline in the Sun newspaper, end of the world due in 9 days. And this was taken quite seriously, that they were arguing we mustn't start the LHC. This is the inside the newspaper. Scientists are trying to stop the most powerful experiment. And then there's quite a good description of the LHC here. But over here is more interesting. Don't worry, there's still time to try out every position in the Kama Sutra in the 9 days left to the end of the world. And then it says what you can do in that period. You can drive to Switzerland. Well, I'd already booked my ticket, so that was okay. And you can cancel deliveries of your newspaper. That was good information because I might have forgotten to do it. Well, anyway, on the 10th of September, here we are. And here we are in the control room when the first beam went round one way around the LHC. And here you see Howard Chopper, myself, Carla Rubio, many other people. So that was a moment that was tremendously exciting. And that afternoon, the headline on the newspapers was "World Survives Big Bang." That wasn't really right, because although on that morning, beams had been sent in both directions around the LHC, in fact, no collisions had taken place. They'd never been sent around simultaneously. So even if the doomsayers had been right, we would not have destroyed the universe. There was a catastrophic failure 9 days later, and which took some time to repair until November 29, when the machine restarted, and then it worked. All hail to those who built it. The machine, which worked way beyond expectations, and the real hero here, I think, is the next speaker, Lynn Evans. Sorry, I don't know how I've got out of the slideshow and gone back to the previous slide. I need to get into it again. Here we go. Hang on a minute. Try to be more careful. Yeah, the real hero, I think, is LHC. The detector is Lynn Evans, a beautiful machine he built. The detectors are working beyond our expectations, and the computing. When we put forward the proposal, we didn't think it'd be possible to analyze the data, but we said, don't worry. Computing is invented so fast, by the time it's improving so fast, we'll be able to do it. And we were able to do it. Concluding remarks. The approval of the LHC depended on a robust scientific case, uniqueness, unanimous support of the world's particle physics community, technical success, no technical bump in the budget. The next major project will require similar things, a reasonable budget envelope. It will also benefit because now particle physics, because of the discovery of the Higgs boson, has become very well known to the public, will benefit from public support, but that won't be enough. The hard-headed people in the finance ministries are going to want more than public support. CERN has succeeded beyond its founders' wildest dreams. I don't think they'd have ever imagined this 17-mile, 27-kilometer tunnel here, nor the next project, which is being proposed, which will be 100 kilometers and go under the lake here. They would never have imagined that. Nor, I would think, they would imagine the growth in the number of users who come to CERN, of which 40% come from outside the member states. So CERN has fulfilled its founder aims, and let us hope that the future will be as glorious as the past. Viva CERN. Thank you very much.